Marilyn Monroe was never just a Hollywood star in the Kennedy orbit. In the rumors that followed her, she was treated as disposable, shuffled aside when she became inconvenient. But the brothers made a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated her, and later rumors claimed she kept notes in a small red diary, though no version of that story has ever been conclusively verified. When she threatened to go public, she stopped being a private embarrassment, and in the eyes of some, became a political risk. This isn't just a story about a tragic death, it's about a chaotic night, an imperfect investigation and decades of rumors that rushed in to fill the gaps. Marilyn Monroe was never just a dumb blonde. That was a mask she wore to survive. Beneath the peroxide was a woman of fierce intelligence who devoured Dostoevsky and Freud. She sought validation for her mind. But in 1950s Hollywood, her mind was irrelevant. Her body was the asset, and that asset made her a target. By 1959, Marilyn was adrift. Her marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller had failed. She was vulnerable. Enter the Rat Pack. Frank Sinatra, walking the line between show business and organized crime, became her broker. Through the Sinatra-Lawford Mafia nexus, Marilyn was introduced to the Kennedy orbit. To Marilyn, the Kennedys were American royalty. If the president wanted her, she reasoned, she must be worth something. For JFK, however, she was a trophy. Raised by a father who viewed women as conquests, Jack Kennedy saw Marilyn as the ultimate status symbol. But Marilyn fell in love. She believed the whispers. She believed she could save him from his loneliness and become the First Lady. This delusion was her fatal flaw. She began calling the White House, leaving messages for the general, flying on private planes to meet him. At first, JFK was amused, but by 1962 the Cold War was freezing over, and J. Edgar Hoover was watching. The FBI director hated the Kennedys and was obsessed with Marilyn, viewing her as a security risk. Hoover's FBI kept close tabs on perceived risks, and Monroe's name surfaced repeatedly in the climate of Cold War paranoia. JFK knew one leaked recording could destroy his presidency. He had to protect the presidency, and in that kind of calculus, the woman on the outside is always the first to be cut loose. JFK pulled away. The calls stopped. The Secret Service blocked her path. For a woman with deep abandonment issues, this was psychological annihilation. But Marilyn didn't fade. She fought. She became louder. She made threats. And she had leverage. During their nights together, JFK had let his guard down. He treated her as a sounding board, assuming a dumb blonde wouldn't understand geopolitics. She did. She heard about the CIA's plots to kill Fidel Castro. She heard about mafia collusion. She heard about nuclear testing, and that claim, more than the affair itself, is what made people around her panic. By spring 1962, the Kennedys realized they had a massive problem. They needed a handler to silence her. Enter Robert F. Kennedy. Later accounts and speculation placed him in Los Angeles around Monroe's final weeks, but the details remained disputed. But the plan failed catastrophically. Instead of ending the affair, Bobby stepped into it. This was the pass around. Marilyn was transferred from one brother to the other like state property. For a brief moment, she thought Bobby was her salvation. She was wrong. She was falling deeper into the web, sleeping with the two most powerful men in America and documenting their secrets in red ink. As the summer of 1962 approached, the walls closed in. The trap was set. The king was done with his toy. The prince was failing to control her, and the men in the shadows worried that the only way to silence the blonde was to stop her heart. We leave Marilyn here, on the precipice of that final summer. 36 years old, beautiful, and terrifyingly alone in her Brentwood hacienda. She clutches a silent phone, surrounded by pill bottles. She thinks she is fighting for love. She doesn't realize she is fighting for her life. The red diary sits on her nightstand, a symbol of what she believed gave her leverage and what others feared could explode. The machinery of the high society cover-up is quietly beginning to hum. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe had become a ghost in her own life. The woman who smiled from every newsstand in America was disintegrating behind the closed doors of her hacienda at 12,305 5th Helena Drive. The telephone, once her lifeline to the centers of power, had become an instrument of torture. She called the White House switchboard at all hours, her voice oscillating between the breathy seduction of a lover and the desperate pleading of a frightened child. But the line was dead. The code name she used, the General, Mrs. Paul, no longer worked. The operators, under strict orders from the Oval Office, politely but firmly walled her off. John F. Kennedy, the King of Camelot, was done. He had consumed the fantasy of Marilyn Monroe, and finding the reality too messy, too needy, and too dangerous, he had discarded the husk. But in the ruthless arithmetic of the Kennedy dynasty, you do not simply throw away a woman who knows where the bodies are buried, you manage her. It was this necessity that brought Robert F. Kennedy to Los Angeles. Bobby Kennedy was the antithesis of his brother Jack. Where Jack was cool, detached, and famously promiscuous, Bobby was intense, moralistic, and fiercely protective of his family's reputation. He was the Attorney General of the United States, the ruthless enforcer who was waging war on organized crime. He was sent west with a specific mission to clean up the president's mess. He was supposed to retrieve any letters, ensure Marilyn's silence, and gently guide her into obscurity. But the plan failed in the most catastrophic way possible. Instead of neutralizing the threat, the enforcer became the new lover. The psychology of this transition, the pass-around, is the cruelest aspect of Marilyn's final days. It wasn't a romance, it was a transfer of ownership. To the Kennedys, Marilyn was not a partner. She was a perk of the presidency, a family heirloom to be shared among the brothers. For Marilyn, however, the arrival of Bobby was a second chance at salvation. She projected all her desperate hopes onto him. She convinced herself that Jack was just a cold politician, but Bobby was a man of feeling. He was sensitive. He listened to her talk about civil rights and poetry. She deluded herself into believing that he was the one who would finally save her. In later tellings of the story, Robert Kennedy is repeatedly placed in Los Angeles and linked to Lawford's Circle, though these claims rely heavily on contested testimony. Marilyn and Bobby were spotted together, walking on the beach, their heads close together. To the outside world, it looked like intimacy. To observers and gossip columnists, it looked volatile, and the rumors only grew darker, because Marilyn was still talking, and the fear was that she might start telling the wrong people. The Little Red Diary was no longer just a collection of daydreams. It was becoming a dossier. In the intimacy of the bedroom, Bobby, like his brother before him, let his guard down. He underestimated the intelligence of the woman lying next to him. He vented about his war against Jimmy Hoffa. He spoke about the CIA's covert operations to assassinate Fidel Castro, operations that involved the very mobsters like Sam Giancana that he was publicly prosecuting. He spoke about the nuclear missile sites being secretly installed. Marilyn, starved for intellectual validation, wrote it all down. She wanted to prove to herself and perhaps to them that she was worthy of their world. She didn't realize that writing anything down, true or imagined, could make her look unpredictable and therefore dangerous to powerful people. She had transformed herself from a bimbo into a vault of classified information, and vaults that cannot be locked must be destroyed. As the weeks wore on, the pattern repeated itself. Bobby, realizing the magnitude of the mistake he had made, began to pull away. The pressure from Washington was immense. J. Edgar Hoover was hovering, ready to use the affair to destroy the Kennedys. Bobby had to cut the cord. He changed his private number. He stopped visiting. Marilyn's reaction was volcanic. The abandonment by Jack had hurt her heart. The abandonment by Bobby broke her mind. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she had been used. She wasn't a future First Lady. She wasn't a partner. She was a piece of meat to be passed across the table. This realization led to one of the most disturbing and disputed events in the Marilyn Monroe timeline, an event that serves as the grim turning point from neglect to active destruction. Some of the darkest stories attached to Monroe's final months involve unverified claims about a gathering in Palm Springs, and they remain fiercely disputed. In late June or early July 1962, Marilyn was invited to the estate of crooner Bing Crosby in Palm Springs. She was told it would be a small gathering, a chance to see Bobby again. She arrived full of hope. But according to later testimony from witnesses and insiders, including shocking allegations that have surfaced in mafia-connected biographies, it was not a romantic reunion. It was a setup. The intent was to break her will, to show her in the most brutal way possible what her true value was to these men. Allegations have circulated about exploitation and coercion, but these claims are unverified and should be treated as rumor rather than record. It was a power play designed to degrade her, to strip away her delusions of grandeur, to remind her that she was nothing more than a body to be used. If the goal was to silence her through shame, it backfired spectacularly. Marilyn didn't break. She snapped. She returned to Los Angeles not as a cowering victim, but as a woman possessed by a fury she had never known. The dumb blonde mask cracked and fell away, revealing a woman scorned by the most powerful family on earth. She began to tell friends that she felt dirty. She told her masseur about the Kennedy game, and then she dropped the ultimate threat. She called Peter Lawford. She was drunk, slurring her words, but the message was crystal clear. She told him she was tired of being treated like a whore. She told him she had the diary, and she told him she was going to call a press conference. "I'm going to blow the lid off everything," she allegedly threatened. "I'm going to tell the world about Jack and Bobby. I'm going to tell them about the missiles. I'm going to tell them about the mafia. I'm going to ruin you all." This was the moment Marilyn Monroe crossed the Rubicon. In the eyes of the Kennedy machine, she ceased to be a nuisance and became an existential threat. This wasn't just about a sex scandal anymore. If Marilyn went public with what she knew about the CIA/mafia collusion to kill Castro, the Kennedy administration would collapse. Impeachment would be a certainty. Prison was a possibility. Panic rippled through the corridors of power. Phone lines between the White House, the Justice Department, and Lawford's beach house in Santa Monica burned hot. They had a Maryland problem that could no longer be solved with hush money or ignored phone calls. They needed a solution. Some later accounts claim Monroe's home may have been monitored, possibly by private wiretappers, but who was listening and how extensively remains disputed. The walls had ears. Every sob, every pill bottle opening, every frantic phone call was being recorded on magnetic tape in vans parked down the street. Marilyn was living under the feeling of constant scrutiny, surrounded by people she couldn't fully trust. She sensed it. Her paranoia skyrocketed. She told her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, that she was being followed. She said the phone made clicking sounds. Greenson, often portrayed as a caring figure, was himself a pawn in this game, deeply enmeshed with the celebrity network that wanted Marilyn controlled. He prescribed her more sedatives, Nembutal, chloral hydrate, chemical restraints to keep the hysteria at bay. But chemicals couldn't erase the red diary. The book was still there, sitting on her nightstand or hidden under her mattress. It was a ticking time bomb bound in leather. As August 1962 dawned, the heat in Los Angeles was oppressive. The Santa Ana winds were blowing, setting the city on edge. Marilyn was firing staff, rehiring them, making frantic plans for the future while drowning in the present. She was scheduling meetings with producers, buying furniture, trying to convince herself she had a future. But the shadow of the Kennedy brothers loomed over everything. On August 4th, later accounts disputed Robert Kennedy's whereabouts, with some placing him in Los Angeles, while no definitive public record has settled the question. Why would the Attorney General fly south for a few hours? He didn't come for a swim. He came for the book. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The king was in Washington, safe behind the gates of the White House. The enforcer was on the ground in Brentwood, ready to do what was necessary. And Marilyn Monroe, the girl who just wanted to be loved, was waiting in her bedroom, clutching her secrets, unaware that the mechanism of her destruction had already been activated. The pass-around was over. The cleanup was about to begin. It is chilling to imagine Marilyn in those final days. She was the most famous woman in the world, yet she had zero allies. Some accounts claim Sinatra distanced himself as Monroe became politically toxic, but the motives are murky and heavily mythologized. Her ex-husbands were gone. Her doctors were feeding her pills. Some critics have argued Murray and the doctors exerted heavy control over Monroe's routines, but claims of deliberate spying remain speculative. She was totally isolated. The red diary was her only leverage, her only shield. She thought it gave her power. She thought it would force them to respect her, or at least to negotiate. She didn't understand the rules of the game she was playing. In the world of high-stakes politics, you don't negotiate with a person holding a grenade. You pull the pin before they can throw it. If the pass-around was the emotional murder of Marilyn Monroe, what followed was the systematic dismantling of her sanity. By July 1962, the affair with Bobby Kennedy had curdled into a toxic standoff. But unlike the dozens of other women the Kennedy brothers had discarded, Marilyn had a weapon. It wasn't blackmail in the traditional sense. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for dignity. And she was holding a small red moleskin notebook that contained enough explosive material to turn the White House into a crater. To understand why the Attorney General of the United States, the man responsible for law and order, would personally involve himself in the silencing of an actress, we must look at the specific contents of that diary. It wasn't just pillow talk. It was treason. During their weekends together in the post-coital haze where arrogance often masquerades as intimacy, Bobby and Jack had been indiscreet. They had treated Marilyn as a sounding board, a pretty ear into which they could pour their frustrations about the Cold War. They underestimated her. They assumed a dumb blonde wouldn't understand the nuances of geopolitics. But Marilyn, the autodidact who read Dostoevsky, understood perfectly, and she wrote it down. According to later reports from those who saw the diary or heard Marilyn quote from it, the book contained references to the Murder Inc. plot, the CIA's secret collusion with mafia boss Sam Giancana to assassinate Fidel Castro. It contained details about nuclear testing sites in the Nevada desert. It contained the names of FBI agents who were double-crossing J. Edgar Hoover. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a scorned lover. She had inadvertently become an unauthorized archive of top-secret clearance information. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1962, with the Cuban Missile Crisis looming on the horizon, Marilyn was no longer a bimbo. She was a loose cannon on the deck of a ship sailing through a minefield. The Kennedy machine realized they had made a catastrophic error. They couldn't just ignore her anymore. They had to neutralize her. And the method they chose was not negotiation, it was psychological warfare. This leads us to the darkest, most debated chapter of Marilyn's final weeks, the night at Bing Crosby's. In late June 1962, Marilyn was invited to the desert estate of crooner Bing Crosby in Palm Springs. The invitation was framed as a peace offering, a chance to see Bobby Kennedy away from the prying eyes of Los Angeles. Marilyn, desperate for closure or perhaps still clinging to the delusion of a relationship, agreed to go. What happened that night was not a romantic reunion. It was a calculated exercise in degradation. According to dark rumors and later testimony from mafia-connected insiders, the gathering was a trap. The intent was to break Marilyn's spirit, to shame her into silence. Witnesses suggest she was drugged, not enough to kill her, but enough to render her compliant, pliable, and confused. In this state, she was reportedly subjected to sexual humiliation by the powerful men present. She was passed around, treated like a party favor, reduced strictly to her biological function. The message was brutal and clear. You are not a first lady. You are not a partner. You are a whore. This is all you are good for. Know your place. It was a tactic straight out of the dark medicine playbook of the elite. Use trauma to shatter the ego. If you make the victim feel dirty enough, worthless enough, they will retreat into silence. They will be too ashamed to speak. But the Kennedy machine made a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated Marilyn's resilience. This was a woman who had survived a childhood of foster homes and abuse. She didn't break. She hardened. The humiliation at Crosby's house didn't silence her. It radicalized her. She returned to Los Angeles trembling with rage. She told her close friend and masseur, Ralph Roberts, that she felt used and dirty. She realized that the love she thought existed was a hallucination. The Kennedys didn't love her. They despised her. And for a woman who had spent her entire life begging to be loved, being despised was the ultimate trigger. Her world narrowed to the size of that house, and every sound started to feel like surveillance. Marilyn's paranoia skyrocketed. She knew her phone was bugged. She heard the clicks on the line. She knew she was being followed. Private investigator Fred Otash, known as the King of the Wiretappers, had been hired by Jimmy Hoffa to bug Marilyn's house, hoping to catch Bobby in a compromising position. At the same time, the FBI was listening. The CIA was listening. 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive was the most surveilled house in America, and the listeners heard the threat that signed her death warrant. In the final days of July, Marilyn made a series of frantic calls. She called her press agent. She called Peter Lawford. She was drunk, slurring her words, fueled by Nembutal and fury. She dropped the bomb. "I'm going to call a press conference," she allegedly threatened. "I'm going to blow the lid off everything. I'm going to bring the diary. I'm going to show the world who Jack and Bobby really are." Imagine the scene in the listening van parked down the street. The agents must have frozen. A press conference with Marilyn Monroe, the most famous woman on earth, sitting in front of a bank of microphones, reading classified secrets from a red book. It would bring down the government. It would end the Kennedy dynasty. It was a national security emergency. The threat was relayed to the White House and the Justice Department immediately. The order of operations shifted. Containment was no longer an option. Erasure was the only path left. Marilyn had cornered the wolves. She thought the threat of the diary would force them to respect her. She didn't understand that when you corner a wolf, it doesn't negotiate. It attacks. On August 3rd, the day before she died, Marilyn was manic. She was making plans. She was buying furniture. She was rehiring staff. She was acting like a woman with a future. This contradicts the suicidal depression narrative the media later fed the public. She wasn't planning to die. She was planning to fight. She believed she held the aces, but she didn't know that the dealer had already rigged the deck. The night of August 3rd was filled with ominous silence. The usual calls didn't come. The handlers pulled back. It was calm before the storm. The decision had been made. The red diary had to be retrieved at all costs, and the woman holding it had to be silenced permanently. As the sun rose on Saturday, August 4th, Marilyn Monroe woke up for the last time. She was alone in her hacienda, surrounded by the invisible wires of the surveillance state. The diary sat on her nightstand, a small book of paper that weighed more than a nuclear warhead. She spent the day making calls, trying to reach Bobby, trying to get an answer. She didn't know that Bobby was already on his way, not to hold her, not to love her, but to end it. The king's toy had become the kingdom's greatest liability, and in the world of high-stakes power, liabilities are liquidated. The stage is now set for the final act. The enforcer is landing in Los Angeles, the cleaners are on standby, and the red book is waiting to be stolen. Saturday, August 4th, 1962. The last day of Marilyn Monroe's life began in a haze of heat and manic energy. But as the sun dipped below the Santa Monica Mountains, the atmosphere at 12,305 5th Helena Drive shifted from anxious to lethal. The trap that had been set in Washington was about to spring in Brentwood. For decades, the official story has told us that Marilyn spent a quiet evening alone, depressed, before swallowing a handful of pills. But the witnesses, the surveillance logs, and the secret recordings tell a radically different story. Marilyn wasn't alone. She was under siege. Around late afternoon, a car arrived at the property. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a doctor. It was the Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy. He was accompanied by Peter Lawford, his brother-in-law, and the family's Hollywood fixer. They didn't knock. They walked in. Some writers and investigators have claimed recordings existed, but no definitive, publicly verified tape has settled what happened. It wasn't a lover's quarrel. It was an interrogation. Bobby was frantic. He demanded the diary. "Where is it?" he was heard shouting. "Where is the book?" Marilyn, fueled by a mixture of champagne, pills, and righteous indignation, screamed back. She felt cornered, but she also felt powerful. She held the leverage. She reportedly yelled, "I feel passed around. I feel used. I feel like a piece of meat." She threatened again to go to the press, to burn the Kennedy house down with her truth. Things turned physical. There were sounds of a struggle, of things being thrown. Marilyn, hysterical and terrified, lunged at Bobby with a small knife or letter opener, but was easily disarmed. Lawford and the bodyguard stepped in. Bobby, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control and that he couldn't reason with her, allegedly told Lawford to take care of it or to call the doctor to shut her up. Bobby Kennedy left the house. He had to. He needed to be seen elsewhere to establish an alibi. He was driven away, leaving Marilyn in the hands of the fixers. This is where speculation turns darker, with some alleging deliberate harm and others arguing the evidence does not prove it. Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, was summoned. Greenson is a complex figure in this tragedy, a man who ostensibly tried to save her, but was deeply embedded in the mechanism of her control. When he arrived, Marilyn was frantic, likely threatening to expose everyone. The goal was no longer to retrieve the diary. The goal was to sedate the threat. What follows is the contested forensic debate, with critics pointing to inconsistencies and official accounts disputing that they prove murder. Marilyn had a high tolerance for Nembutal. Swallowing pills wouldn't act fast enough, and she might vomit them up. If they wanted to silence her quickly and permanently without leaving needle marks on her arms, there was only one efficient delivery system, the rectum. This is the enema theory, one of several disputed explanations offered by critics, and it remains unproven. It is believed that under the guise of calming her down, or perhaps forcibly restraining her, a massive dose of chloral hydrate and Nembutal was administered via enema. This method is brutal and effective. The drugs enter the bloodstream almost instantly, bypassing the liver's initial filtration. It hits the system like a sledgehammer. Imagine the horror of those final moments. Marilyn, the most desired woman in the world, pinned down in her own bed, violated one last time by the men who claimed to be helping her. As the chemicals flooded her veins, the fight would have drained out of her. The screaming would have stopped. The breathing would have slowed. The silent scream was drowned out by the chemical fog. She drifted into a coma, and then her heart stopped. It was done. The king's toy was broken. But the night was far from over. Now came the cleanup. Between the time of her death and the time the police were called, there is a gap of nearly 5 hours. This is the gap of the cover-up. Peter Lawford returned to the house. His job was to sanitize the crime scene. He and the handlers tore the house apart. They were looking for the red diary. They ripped through her papers, her drawers, her safe. Whether they found it there or if the coroner handed it over later remains a mystery. But the house was tossed. They found any notes from Jack or Bobby and burned them. They destroyed the phone records that showed her calls to the White House. Then they had to stage the body. Marilyn was found lying face down, nude, with the telephone receiver clutched in her hand. But rigor mortis tells a different story. When a body dies, gravity pools the blood. Marilyn's lividity was on her front, consistent with how she was found. However, reports suggest she had been moved and repositioned to look like a romantic suicide. The phone in her hand was a prop, a symbol of her loneliness, placed there to sell the narrative of the tragic star dying of a broken heart. The housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was busy during these hours. She was washing sheets. Why wash sheets in the middle of the night while your employer is dead? Unless the sheets were stained, perhaps from the fluids of an enema gone wrong, or the vomit that never made it to the autopsy report. The washing machine was the sound of evidence being destroyed. At 4:25 a.m., only after the house was clean, the diary was secured, and Bobby Kennedy was safely out of the city, did they call the LAPD. Sergeant Jack Clemens was the first officer on the scene. He was a veteran cop, cynical and sharp. He took one look at the room and knew it was a lie. It was the most staged crime scene I'd ever seen, he later said. The pill bottles were lined up neatly on the nightstand. There was no water glass to wash them down. Marilyn's body was too posed. Eunice Murray was evasive and nervous. Clemens tried to investigate. He tried to secure the scene, but higher-ups quickly took control, and the investigation settled into an official narrative that many have questioned ever since. Clemens was told to write it up as a suicide and stop asking questions. When he refused to stay silent, he was pushed out of the force. The suicide narrative was broadcast to the world before the sun even fully rose. Marilyn Monroe dead of overdose. It was simple. It was believable. She was unstable. She was an addict. She was sad. The public bought it because it fit the tragic arc of her life. But the physical reality of that room told the story of a murder. Some critics pointed to the reported absence of residue as suspicious, while others argued it does not conclusively indicate non-oral dosing. Some interpretations focused on reported drug distribution in the body, but the findings have been argued both ways and never produced consensus. The bruises on her body indicate a struggle. The missing diary, the missing phone records, and the silence. The silence of 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive that night was heavy with the weight of a state execution. A woman had been liquidated because she forgot her place. She thought she was a player in the Game of Thrones, but she was just a pawn. And when a pawn threatens the king, it is removed from the board. As the coroner's van finally pulled away with her body, Marilyn Monroe left behind a house that had been scrubbed of her soul. The diary was gone. The secrets were safe. And the men who killed her, the doctor, the actor, the politician, went back to their lives, leaving the world to mourn a tragedy they had engineered. But they forgot one thing. They could scrub the house, but they couldn't scrub the timeline. The 4-hour gap would remain a scar on history, a permanent question mark that no amount of Kennedy money could erase. The death of Marilyn Monroe was the ultimate expression of the high society cover-up. It wasn't just about hiding a body. It was about rewriting reality. The media, the police, and the government colluded to create a fairy tale of self-destruction to hide a story of state-sponsored murder. Marilyn died holding a phone that wasn't connected to anything. It is the perfect metaphor for her relationship with the Kennedys. She was speaking into a void, believing someone was listening, while on the other end, they were simply waiting for her to stop breathing. Now the body heads to the morgue, and the final act, the autopsy that defied science, is about to begin. The morning after Marilyn Monroe died, the high society cover-up seemed complete. The body was morgued, the diary was gone, and the suicide headlines were printed. The Kennedys had won. They had silenced the threat and scrubbed the stain. But in the Greek tragedies Marilyn loved, hubris is always followed by nemesis. The gods do not leave such debts unpaid. In the years that followed, a violent darkness descended upon the men who broke her. It was as if by destroying the toy, they unleashed a curse. John F. Kennedy, the king who used her, had only 15 months left to live before his own head was shattered in Dallas. Robert F. Kennedy, the enforcer who silenced her, was gunned down 6 years later in the very same city where he left Marilyn to die. The fixers, Lawford, Sinatra, Giancana, spiraled into addiction, irrelevance, or mob execution. One by one, the architects of her destruction fell. The toy was gone, but she had taken the kings with her. Amidst the carnage, only one man stood tall, Joe DiMaggio. The Yankee Clipper arrived in Los Angeles broken-hearted and furious. He claimed her body, paid for the funeral, and issued a ban that echoed louder than any speech. No Kennedys, no Sinatra, no Hollywood elite. People close to DiMaggio later claimed he blamed powerful men around her, but the exact words vary by source. For 20 years, DiMaggio sent red roses to her crypt 3 times a week. He never remarried. He never spoke her name to the press. His silence was the ultimate indictment of the men who had used her. He was the only one who knew that the suicide was a lie. Decades have passed, and a strange verdict has been rendered by history. The powerful men have faded into textbooks, but Marilyn Monroe has become a deity. Her crypt in Westwood is covered in lipstick kisses from visitors who travel thousands of miles to stand near her. They don't kiss JFK's grave. They come to Marilyn. They come because she is the patron saint of the used and the silenced. Her story peels back the curtain of the golden age to reveal the rot underneath. The Kennedy legacy will forever be stained by her blood. You cannot look at Camelot without seeing the ghost of the blonde woman in the shadows, holding her red diary. The diary is gone, burned or buried, but the message survived. The system tried to reduce her to a piece of meat, but in death, she defeated them. She became the one thing they couldn't control, a legend.